Thank you. I'm Jillian from Open Society Foundations. My question is for Bassam. Given that you didn't address Reconstruction, do you see that as possibly a third phase, Reconstruction being more by other means, or how would you conceive it? And do you see any scenarios for Reconstruction that would benefit the Syrian people as opposed to serving their more geopolitical interests?
Oh, by the way.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, well,
Paul Salas from the Middle East Institute. My question is to my friend Daniel. You were sort of arguing that the Rouhani's that phase, or whatever you want to call it, was really taken off the rails by the Syrian conflict, and obviously there's a big effect there. But I mean, another way to look at it, how would you analyze it? It seems to me that the Iranian system, which he describes sort of as a veto system with kind of electoral system, has that sort of recurring, possibly, up and then deflate, up and then deflate. We saw it in Khatami, we're seeing it now with Rouhani, that's a systemic thing. In other words, I don't, whether Syria had happened or not, or whether the JCPOA had happened or not, would it not be the case that that valve is always going to be opened a bit, closed a bit, opened a bit, closed a bit, unless then some other resolution? Is that the correct analysis?
Hi, I'm Alex Stark. I'm a PhD candidate at Georgetown University. My question is for Bassam, or maybe for all of you. I'm not sure. But I'm struck by the potential for escalation of the conflict in Syria between Iran and Israel. That sort of seems like that's the direction that things have been taking lately. And I'm wondering if you share that concern, and if you think that there are forces either in the region or to do with sort of U.S. policy towards Syria that make that type of escalation more likely? Or do you think the conflict is more or less winding down towards some kind of semi-permanent stalemate at the reconstruction phase?
Okay.
It's working.
It's not very loud. Here, take this one.
Thank you, Julia. A couple of things about reconstruction. I'll speak a little quickly. So there are a few problems with the entire topic of reconstruction, even though there are more events on reconstruction than Trump tweets. So the problem is threefold. The first problem is that most people consider the problem in Syria, or most organizations that are rushing to deal with this or to reap the rewards, consider the problem to be one of destruction. So the idea is, well, let's reconstruct what was destroyed, as though this was like some sort of a tsunami or a natural disaster, and now we have to fix the place. So that is one problem, and it's attracting literally everyone, East and West, IFIs and otherwise, to actually to go to Syria, and none of these things right now are feasible because of the second issue, which is reconstruct where. If you're going to actually have a comprehensive reconstruction effort or campaign, you need to have a party that you deal with, and if this party is the regime, the Syrian regime, it's going to turn down any reasonable or equitable or sensible plan for reconstruction, because it and its allies are going to actually be first in line to reap the rewards of what has happened for many, many reasons, and because they have the power to do so. So a lot of the wishful thinking about reconstruction doesn't take into account this fact. Second, the other zones, which you can see on the map, which I forgot to address, this is actually a leaked map. I don't know if I will get in trouble. I just got it from somebody in Beirut who was at I don't even know if I should say this, but I have it. And it basically refers to a meeting that was held between the three, Iran, Turkey, and Russia, and how they envision the future, the medium run future, where the regime will be in the middle with its allies, the Americans and the opposition in the south, the Turks and the Syrian opposition in the north, and then the Americans and the Kurds in the east. And the idea is that the reconstruction efforts that happen in all of these zones, in my view, also fall into the same problem that, the problem with the regime that I just addressed. So who to deal with and how to do compartmentalized reconstruction is actually a problem. And thirdly, in all of these cases, the first two cases, and in any future scenarios, as far as I'm concerned, based on what I said earlier, to what extent is reconstruction going to take the interest of the local population into account? To what extent will those concerns and especially of refugees, but also people who are still in Syria, will be trampled by international financial institutions, by various friends of Syria or various friends of the IFIs, whether it's the United States or Gulf countries. So in all cases, this talk of reconstruction is actually very depressing on the emotional level, but on the political level, it just seems non-feasible. And what's happening already in about 20% of the effort that's taking place within regime territory, it is not benefiting those who need it most, because there is reconstruction underway, and it's just not geared towards those who lost most.
Let me just the Turkish zone up there in the map is interesting because the Turks have a very specific plan for that part of the country, and that is to create this sphere of influence, to move in after Manbij is resolved with the United States, and to move in and create this area where Syrian refugees can return to Syria. And with them will come AKP-affiliated infrastructure and construction firms, because that is the way in which the AKP works, based on this type of patronage through real estate and construction and so on and so forth. So this is which is something that is starting to kind of run out in Turkey, and so it's going to be externalized into northern Syria in the way it was done in northern Iraq. I'm not as up on the complications of this, but this is the Turkish intention, and it'll do a number of things. One, serve the AKP politically. Two, move large numbers of Syrians back into Syria, and put a significant amount of pressure on the regime in Damascus.
Sorry.
So, Paul, I largely agree with you. I mean, there's the ebb and flow, closing and opening. This is how these systems of power sharing work. I do think that Iran's capacity to make that happen is the only path to some sort of change. I do not believe that a regime collapse scenario is feasible, or if it happens, it will lead to democracy, more a coup d'etat scenario. So whatever happens, happens through the existing mechanisms. Now, when Rouhani took power, and eventually, of course, presided or contributed to the agreement with the international community, there was a severe backlash. Because the hardliners view any victory by Rouhani in that regard as reinforcing his own troops at home, as it were, right? So they were going to hit hard. But I think he might have survived that had it not been for Syria. I mean, the Syrian equation was absolutely central to really closing the space, if we think about cycles, during which there can be substantial changes. They can be reversed, but over time they might be more difficult to reverse. And finally, the big question here, of course, is who's the next Rahbar, who's the next supreme leader? Because in the Iranian context, whoever occupies that position, they're the ones who have the authority to redefine the rules of the game, or to push them forward or backward. So that's going to be a huge struggle. But you're right. I mean, this is a system where the capacity for change is limited by all kinds of factors. And yes, if Iran could disengage from the region, it would be great. But as the old saying goes, if Grandpa had wheels, he'd be a wheelbarrow. It's not going to happen anytime soon. So I would keep track of the next struggle over who's going to succeed Khamenei, because it could be vital to the future of that country.
The question about Syria and about Israel and Iran. Before the Syrian uprising, so you had the United States, to an extent, much less so, and on the other hand, Saudi Arabia and Israel itching vis-a-vis confronting Iran. 7 years into the uprisings, and certainly in Syria's case, Iran came out on top for various reasons, just like it did in the case of Iraq in 2003. And the itching has become greater. So did the collaboration between Saudi Arabia and Israel, a fitting collaboration between two states that are extremely problematic, under the auspices of the United States. So there is now a desire among these three, and it's tough to gauge the U.S. position, these days 100%, but definitely in the case of Saudi Arabia and Israel, vis-a-vis downgrading again or diminishing the gains of Iran. How this will actually play out in the real world, it's very difficult to sort of predict. But we are seeing right now provocations from Israel to begin with, historically in the past several years into Syria, and recently in the reverse direction, also with the downing, in addition, of the first Israeli airplane jet fighter by Syrians. So I also am not in the business of prediction. I forget who said it earlier, but it looks
Your
like...
former advisor.
Yes, yes, that's true, Dan. But I am not 100% sure if this escalation is headed towards a serious confrontation. I do not see this necessarily being an intention, though things might spin out of control.
Thank you. Nora, here, and any other questions? One more, good, okay. I think you have a fresh mic.
My question is for Dr. Jillian. I wanted to ask about you were cautioning us as we're looking at this and as scholars not to reproduce the same narratives that regimes are producing about the end of protest and where it begins and where it climaxes. And so I'm wondering, where do you suggest that what should we be paying attention to? Who should we be paying attention to? And do you have, not predictions, but any kind of sensibilities of how a lot of these contests over power will be resolved? For example, in Jordan, as opposed to any of the other examples you were giving, where there is a direct contest between the regime and other alternatives.
My name is Abdullah Hidayah from the Arabic Foundation, and my question is also to Dr. Jillian, the exact same point more or less. But when we took to streets in Tahrir and Cairo, not only that we didn't have timeline or a deadline or whatever, we didn't even know where is this going to take us. But what we understood is that 18 days later on, there was sort of what it seems to us as a battlefield over narratives. Who is defining what is a revolution, what is not, who's a good citizen, who is not, and so on. And the field that the protesters or the activists once mastered, the social media, where all the narratives were made at the time, is now being penetrated by the state itself. So the state has the existence, has its presence on social media, and they're fighting, and to a huge extent, they're actually succeeding in not only silencing their opposition, but also constructing their own narratives. So yes, the protesters now in Egypt, activists mainly, but they are suffering from what you exactly said. So my question is how do you see this narrative is evolving in the near future? Because this battlefield seems to be extremely won by the state and the state actors, not only in Egypt but also regionally. So where is this going to go? Especially that many people in the region also understand that revolution is not like a switch on, switch off thing. We understood that this is going to be a process, hopefully not really what we imagined it would end up being, but this is a process, and it's continuing. And as one of the counter narratives to that in Egypt was the Sawra Mustamira, that revolution is continuing, because it was present that everyone is repeating over and over that it's over and it's bad and it's failed and you got to face it, you got to start over. So I'm just interested to see how is that going.
So my question is about Iranian politics. We made a good point of showing how the international context of animosity with Israel or Syria constrain certain actors within Iran to reform this camp. But I'm not getting a clear sense of what are the strengths of each faction. You're right about it being fluid, because recently Ahmadinejad, the right of the Islamic Republic, was standing up to the judiciary, which you usually expect the left to do. So you're very much right on the fluidity, but how is the strengths of each faction going to play out as politics evolves in Iran? Because the right in Iran does have the backhand of the revolutionary guards, or the resources that the reformists or the left could leverage. Are they going to have to tap into some of the popular mobilization they had in 2009? We saw a disconnect between the major green uprising that was concentrated in big cities like Tehran, and the recent wave was class-based, lower class in the provinces. So I was wondering if you could shed a bit more light on what are the strengths of each faction, how they're going to play out over the power struggles.
And if I could just add to that, perhaps also contextualize this in Professor Lynch's remarks about the sort of totalitarian nature of power domestically and the exertion of force to quash these revolutions and rebellions internally, and how this actually fits into that geopolitical landscape that he laid out. Perhaps you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, and thank you for your question very much. So I guess like as scholars or analysts trying to make sense of it, my answer isn't that there'd be one frame that's better than any other one, but to sort of choosing a frame, whether we call it a temporality or a narrative frame or an epoch or periodization, is going to be structured by the kinds of questions we want to ask, right? Of course. So why do some uprisings turn violent and other ones don't are going to make us parse it in a particular way. For me, I always want to sort of then ask, I do have my particular questions I'm interested in, but then to say, what is being obscured by this? If I zoom out, what do I see? It's kind of the Google Earth thing. If you zoom in and you can see the gum on the sidewalk, it's amazing, but what else am I missing? So as a methodology, to sort of take the time to stand back and say, what else is being obscured? What are the international flows? Is this about capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, security, trade? And zoom in, what comes into focus. And to sort of keep those in mind when we settle on what is the picture or the story we want to tell, but to have considered a whole range of those before we just say, obviously we'll compare the uprisings and put these in this column and these in this column, and not even consider those bigger flows. For my personal interest, I'm particularly interested in the dynamics of the micro, the sort of moments of like how something becomes possible, you know, the event in the literature, how something is turning moments with the storming of the Bastille or the first days, and something has changed. And the big flows, the longer flows. I think ultimately they're a lot about, you know, economy, political economy is the bottom line for a lot of this, state and power of various sources. So, but it's a kind of moving between scales, and asking yourself what is being left out. You know, you can't bring everything into view, or you won't have a compelling story. But I think to consider that. As for where they're going, I obviously don't know. I do think in Jordan, which is, you know, the topic of my current research, so I talked to tons of activists there, is there's no stomach for revolutionary uprising there right now at all. And someone I've known for 25 years who's a very committed Marxist has said, and I'll paraphrase this, we hate the security state, but they better get this right. You know, not now. You know, we don't, but that out there is so much worse, so we're going to hold back for the moment. For, you know, the so-called loyal support base, I think it's the same. You know, the alternatives look pretty bad for them right now. You know, they're seeing numbers diminish. The Syrians aren't going anywhere. The Iraqis aren't going anywhere, right? And so they're nervous about that. And so I think they're still supportive of the regime to some extent, but they're voicing that critique as they've always voiced. If you were listening, you could always hear them, you know, celebrating moments of resistance in the 30s. They still have these annual festivals of, you know, talking about their great resistance to the first Abdullah. So I think in the long term, we might see something emerge again, but because of the violence surrounding Jordan and the region, that there's a pullback on that revolutionary protest. But as you see elsewhere, there's tons of protests happening that still defying. But they're small, they're finding spaces that they're not going to be repressed seriously, they're not calling for the overthrow of the regime. And I'm sorry, I didn't get your name?
Abdullah.
Abdullah, thank you so much. And you know, I'm always humbled when I'm talking about something that happens in a moment and someone's like, well, I was there. So, you know, I always makes me nervous. But I'm glad to hear it sort of captured a bit of that. So narratives is a good synonym for temporalities. I just want to draw attention to the timeness of it, the sort of open-endedness. And I do think, I mean, the people that I've interviewed and talked to a lot of them are holding on to, you know, we're not there. And that's a kind of a temporality. It's sort of like, it's an ongoing, unstable moment. And you're absolutely right. The regimes have every resource at their advantage to crush that. And you know, they did it in Bahrain, they're doing it in Egypt. They're like, it's not happening, nothing's going on, nothing to see here, move along. I think, they tend to win at those because they have so many resources in the short term, but I don't know in the long term that they will. And I think the fact that they have to invest so many resources to quash those narratives tells you they're afraid of it.
Dan, did you want to address?
Very quickly, I want to link these conversations up, which are very interesting, and dwell on an issue that Jillian is raising in terms of these protest movements. There are two things I want to focus on. First, what lessons do protesters learn from protest, from the decisions that they and their leaders have made? One may be that, well, we can't tolerate that level of instability. We're sort of stuck with a security apparatus. Another possibility is, well, we made mistakes in the alliances. There's somebody at Doha Institute doing an interesting study of the Muslim Brethren leaders and the kinds of conclusions and lessons they've drawn from the kinds of decisions, most of which were very bad, that the Muslim Brethren leaders adopted in Egypt during that crucial period. So, the kinds of lessons, the kind of political learning that takes place is important. The other thing is we have this kind of worldwide phenomenon of this disassociation of the rural and the urban. And of course, in Western Europe, populists in Hungary and elsewhere sort of manipulate and leverage this divergence, remobilizing, because it's happening in our backyard, almost literally here in the United States, whereby populists mobilize the rural area against the urban intelligentsia, the cosmopolitans, the Jews, the Muslims, all those outsiders, right? Now, in the case of Iran, of course, Ahmadinejad and the hardliners always tried to remobilize the countryside against the urban elites. This was part of their strategy. And now you have these countryside, leaders and more activists and spontaneous protests and leaders rising up, and the regime is not necessarily, they tried to manipulate them in the beginning. A lot of this was kind of manipulated by the hardliners, but that took a life of its own and they couldn't control it. But nevertheless, in terms of sort of leverage, it's really hard to build. Vali Nasser had a great piece in Foreign Policy where he talked about the need for an alliance. You may have read it, between these sort of two sectors, the old reformists, and they are sort of older reformists, and these younger protesters in the villages. But it's really hard to create that kind of institutional basis for mobilization out of nothing. And of course, the Pasdaran, the Basij, they have amazing capacity for mobilization. And finally, I'll add this. One of the big paradoxes in a country such as Iran, where revolutionary ideology is still really important, is that it's very difficult for the reformers to make the argument that they're evolutionists. Because if you're going to have a political pact or some sort of understanding, you've got to convince somebody in a regime that your agenda will not lead to their destruction. And for the hardliners, a little reform is like being a little pregnant. I mean, they don't see that option. And so as hard as Khatami and then Rouhani for a while tried to make the case for reform, they couldn't convince anybody among the hardliners that there was an option, a reformist option they could adopt without leading to the obliteration of the regime, to self-destruction. And regimes, we know, don't usually self-destruct. So the reformers face a tremendous sort of contradiction, and that is no matter how much they promise to take it slow, to take it easy, and so on, from the vantage point of those powerful hardliners, there's no such thing as taking it easy. They see a little reform as simply unacceptable, and that's really not the basis for any kind of politics of contestation and pact making, as we call it.